The sensation was not pain, for the hive mind did not feel pain. It was aberration. It was wrongness. The world of Noctis Ulthrin was rich, teeming with the raw material that fueled the great work, yet its core was laced with a mineral of profound indigestibility. It was an element of absolute negation, a conceptual poison that resisted the biochemical processes of consumption. The capillary towers plunged deep into the planet's crust, shuddered as they drew up this silent, nullifying substance. The digestion pools, vast organic cauldrons that could render adamantium to slurry, frothed with a sterile black sludge. For the splinter fleet, a minor unnamed tendril of a greater behemoth, it was a slow, grinding death. Bioforms were reabsorbed, their mass redirected to the agonizingly slow process of metabolizing the impossible. The hive mind, a consciousness woven from trillions of organisms, felt the threads of its being fray as the anti-energy of the Blackstone permeated its every vessel. Then the change occurred. It was not a conscious decision, but a biological imperative, the ultimate expression of the Tyranid race, adapt or perish. Deep within the Norn Queen, the genetic architect of the fleet, ancient codons, dormant since the birth of the species, were violently rewritten. The null properties of the Blackstone were not rejected but integrated. The very structure of Tyranid chitin began to shift. The glossy organic carapaces hardened and darkened, losing their reflection until they were voids in space, surfaces that drank light and gave nothing back. The psychic signature of the fleet, once a piercing shriek in the warp, began to dim. It fell from a roar to a whisper, and then to a terrifying absolute silence. A hole had been punched in the fabric of the immaterium. Where the fleet moved, the warp grew still and cold. This new entity, reborn in the silent death of Noctis Ulthrin, was given its name by the few doomed astropaths on distant listening posts who survived its passage. They saw not a serpent eating its own tail in a cycle of rebirth, but one that was learning to eat the ghost of its own tail, the ethereal shadow it cast upon the universe. They called it Ouroboros. For decades, the reconstituted fleet drifted. Its hunger had changed. The psychic resonance of life, the beacon that had guided it for eons, was now a muted, unappetizing whisper. The silence within it craved a new stimulus, a new sustenance to fill the void it had become. And then it felt it, a scream from across the void, but not the scream of mortal souls. This was the raw, untamed energy of the Empyrean itself, a violent tear in the skin of reality, where the immaterium bled into the material universe. It was the psychic stench of the Vexgor's subsector, a cluster of worlds long ago conquered and consecrated to the ruinous powers by the Word-Bearer's Legion. Worlds were transformed into sacrificial altars, their atmospheres choked with the fumes of burning, souls, their very soil saturated with demonic energy. To the old hive mind, it would have been anathema. To Ouroboros, it was the scent of a banquet. The drive was no longer just hunger, it was instinct, a predatory pull towards this immense concentration of its new prey. The fleet, a swath of absolute black against the star fields, altered its course. It moved with a renewed, terrible purpose. There was no grand strategy, no malice, only the cold, logical conclusion of a predator seeking its food. The Vexgor subsector was a monument to faith and corruption. Its primary world, Kor Spathi, had been remade in the image of Kolchis. Brazen cathedrals clawed at a sky permanently bruised with the colors of the warp. Rivers of blood flowed from sacrificial fanes, and the population existed in a state of perpetual fanatical worship, their psychic agony a constant offering to the gods. The master of this dark domain, the dark apostle Jared Malk, felt the shift first. It was not a vision or a voice, but a sudden, unnerving quiet in the chorus of the warp. The whispers of his patrons grew faint, as if shouting from across a vast distance. His cadre of psychers and demon-possessed marines clawed at their temples, their third eyes blinded by a spreading, psychic darkness. The arrival of Hive Fleet Ouroboros was not an invasion. It was an eclipse. One moment, the bleeding sky of Kor Spathi was filled with the familiar chaotic constellations of the Eye of Terror. The next, a patch of that sky was simply gone, replaced by a perfect starless black. No shockwave, no augur scream, just a silent, growing void. Demons bound to the planet's surface felt it as a physical chill, a sapping of their strength. The very air, thick with warp energy, seemed to thin, becoming brittle and sterile. Dark Apostle Malk stood on the balcony of his high cathedral, his Crozius Arcanum pulsing with captured energies. He sneered at the void. Another Xenos filth drawn to the light of the gods like a moth to a pyre. He had broken hive fleets before. Their mindless rage was no match for the infinite legions of the warp. "Let them come," he boomed, his voice magically amplified to echo across the capital city. "Let them witness the glory of chaos, summon the legions, let the heavens rain blood and fire." Across the planet, ritual circles blazed to life. Possessed marines roared as their inner demons swelled. The veil between worlds tore open, and the hordes of the warp poured forth. Legions of bloodletters, their brass swords hungry for skulls, materialized in formations of burning rage. Pink horrors gibbered and capered, splitting and multiplying as they unleashed bolts of raw change. It was a tide of immortal fury, the righteous host of the true gods, ready to smite the ignorant beasts that dared trespass upon holy ground. The first spores struck the surface. They did not erupt into frenzied organisms. Instead, they burrowed deep, and from them rose immense obsidian spires that were utterly alien to Tyranid biology. They were not capillary towers, but something else. Warp siphon spires. They were featureless matte black needles that hummed with a silent internal vibration. And as they activated, the demonic host felt the first true touch of fear. The very ground beneath their incorporeal feet grew cold. The raw warp energy that sustained them in the material realm was being drawn away, pulled towards the silent black spires, as if by an irresistible gravity. They felt sluggish, weak. Then the swarm descended. It was a wave of black chitin, a chittering tide of hormagaunts and termagants, their forms subtly different, sharper, their carapaces seeming to bend the light around them. A legion of bloodletters, led by a charging herald of Khorne, met the first wave. The clash was not one of flesh and demonic ichor. As the hormagaunts' scything talons struck the bloodletters, there was no spray of blood. There was a flare of crimson light, a scream of frustrated rage, and then the demon's form dissolved, its essence, its very being, visibly pulled into the attacking Tyranid. The hormagaunt shuddered, and for a moment, a faint bloody luminescence traced the veins beneath its black carapace before fading. It was stronger, faster. It turned to the next demon, its hunger sharpened. From the skies, vast bat-winged creatures descended, Aegis Heritans. Their leathery wings were not membranes of flesh, but were interwoven with black stone filaments that shimmered with anti-life. Where they flew, they projected a cone of absolute silence, a null field that snuffed out warp fire and caused pink horrors to collapse into inert fleshy puddles. The word-bearers watched in stunned horror. Their immortal allies, the avatars of their god's fury, were not being killed. They were being consumed. They were being unmade, their power siphoned away to fuel the very beasts that were destroying them. On his balcony, Dark Apostle Malk's faith began to crack. This was not a battle. This was a harvest. He felt the connection to his patrons flicker and die as one of the great warp siphon spires rose from the earth not a league from his cathedral. The air grew thin, not of oxygen, but of faith, of power, of the very presence of the gods. He was alone, a mortal man in ornate armor, facing an enemy that did not hate, did not rage, did not feel. It only fed. The hive mind registered this new sustenance. It was not the crude matter of biomass. It was pure, potent energy. It was power. It required no digestion, only absorption. The aberration of Noctis Ulthran had become the foundation of a new and perfect form of consumption. The scattered systems of the galaxy, once just stepping stones of matter on the way to the final feast, were now irrelevant. The true hunting grounds were the places where reality was weak, where the endless energies of the immaterium bled through. The hive mind had found its true prey, the great devourer, had learned to hunt gods. The hive mind drifted in a state of profound disorientation. The universe it had known for uncounted millennia was gone, replaced by a muted gray expanse. The symphony of life, the psychic chorus of trillions of mortal souls that had once been a blazing fire in the darkness, was now a distant, muffled drumming, heard through a fathomless ocean of silence. The old hunger, the insatiable drive for biomass that was the core of its very being, had been hollowed out. In its place was a vast aching void, a negative space in its distributed consciousness that mirrored the null properties of the black stone it had consumed. Eons of instinct were rendered obsolete. The scent of a densely populated world was no longer a siren's call, but a bland, tasteless echo. The fleet, a cohesive swath of shadow that blotted out constellations, had become a ghost ship, its purpose erased. For a timeless period, it simply was. It existed, silent and waiting, its trillions of component organisms held in a state of perfect patient stasis. The Norn Queen, the heart of the fleet's creative and adaptive power, lay dormant in her amniotic sanctum, her prodigious mind cycling through the new, alien genetic code that now defined them. She was no longer just a weaver of flesh. She was a sculptor of silence, a crafter of anti-reality. The very bioplasma that coursed through the fleet's arteries ran colder, laced with the inert energy that had unmade their past. The shadow in the warp, once a tool of psychic warfare, was now the fleet's fundamental state of being. Ouroboros did not project silence. It was silence itself. Then a new sensation pierced the gray monotony. It was not a scent or a sound. It was a vibration, a jagged spike on the flat line of existence. It was a discordant, screaming note of pure energy, raw and untamed. It was the feeling of a colossal pressure differential, a place where the barrier between the mundane and the impossible had been worn thin to the point of tearing. The hive mind, for the first time since its agonizing rebirth, focused. Every drone, every warrior, every synaptic node in the vast network of its being turned its attention towards this singular alien stimulus. It was a beacon, but one that shone in a spectrum of reality it had never before perceived. The source was the Vexgor subsector, a festering wound in the cosmos, long since ceded by the crumbling Imperium to the zealots of the word-bearers. Here, faith was a weapon, and reality was its victim. Under the iron rule of the dark apostle Jared Malk, a true evangelist of damnation, the entire subsector had been transformed into a single contiguous altar to the chaos gods. Stars had been forced into new blasphemous alignments. Worlds had their orbits altered to trace the runes of the primordial annihilator. The very laws of physics had been bent and broken by sheer collective will in the ceaseless invocation of the warp's denizens. From this subsector, a constant psychic effluence bled into the galaxy. It was a symphony of damnation, composed of the telepathic screams of sacrificial victims, the triumphant bellows of demons given form, and the unending, fanatical prayers of a billion cultists. To any other hive fleet, it would have been a toxic, incomprehensible storm, a region to be avoided, but to Ouroboros, it was something else entirely. The black stone woven into its being resonated with the raw, chaotic energy. The void within the hive mind felt a pull, a terrible cosmic magnetism. The silence did not wish to destroy the noise. It wished to consume it. The emptiness craved a subject. The hive mind analyzed the stimulus with cold, alien precision. It was not life. It held no biomass, no complex proteins or genetic material to be broken down and reabsorbed. It was formless, potent, and seemingly infinite. It was the scent of power itself, unburdened by the crude vessel of flesh. The dormant Norn Queen stirred. New genetic imperatives, forged in the crucible of Noctis Ultron, flooded the synaptic network. A singular unifying thought, more instinct than strategy, coalesced across the entire fleet. Feast. In the heart of the Vexgor subsector, on the demon world of Kor Spathi, Jarod Malk addressed his legions. He stood upon a balcony of polished bone, overlooking a plaza thronged with 1,000,000 chanting followers and a cohort of hulking, possessed chaos marines. The sky above was not a void of space, but a churning violet sea of raw warp energy, a permanent tear in reality that served as a gateway for his demonic allies. He was a figure of terrible majesty, his crimson power armor inscribed with glowing Caucasian runes, his face a mask of righteous fury and absolute conviction. He and his 17th Legion had achieved what so many others had failed to do. They had brought the perfect truth of the Empyrean into the wretched confines of the material universe. The corpse emperor's slaves wither and die beyond our borders. His voice, amplified by sorcery, boomed across the masses. The foolish Eldar hide in their ghost ships. The brutish orcs slaughter each other in blissful ignorance. But we alone have been blessed. We have turned this squalid corner of the galaxy into a paradise for the gods. The powers of the warp are ours to command. The demons are our brethren in arms. We are invincible. A roar of adulation answered him, a sound that shook the foundations of the cathedral and caused the very air to shimmer. A bloodthirster, bound to service in the plaza below, bellowed in agreement, swinging its colossal axe and sending sprays of ethereal fire into the corrupted sky. Gerard Malk smiled. He was the master of a realm where belief dictated reality. What could possibly threaten such power? He knew of the great Tyranid swarms, the mindless eating machines that plagued the galaxy. They were a force of nature, yes, but a predictable one. They ate flesh and bone. Here in Vexgor, the flesh was merely a conduit for the immortal and the infinite. Let them come. They would find nothing to eat and would be torn apart by legions that could not truly die. Far out in the interstellar dark, the great beast had made its decision. The hive mind did not understand faith, or gods, or demons. It understood only predator and prey, hunger and satiation. And this new scent, this vibrant, violent screaming of raw power from the Vexgor subsector, was the most potent prey it had ever encountered. The silent fleet began to move. Hive ships the size of moons, their blackened hulls absorbing the light of distant stars, slowly, inexorably, pivoted in the void. Biomechanical sphincters opened, venting cold, inert gas as the fleet adjusted its trajectory. There was no rage, no malice, no grand declaration of war. It was the simple, terrifying, and unquestioning biological imperative of a new kind of predator turning its gaze upon a new kind of feeding ground. The shadow was coming. The silence was on the hunt, drawn by a scent of power so immense it promised a feast that could change the nature of the devourer forever. In the Vexgor subsector, silence was sacrilege. The very air was a medium for prayer and pronouncement, a carrier wave for the ceaseless paeans to the dark gods. On every world, 1 billion throats offered up their devotion in an unending chant. In the void between worlds, the solar winds themselves were believed to carry the whispers of demons. For the word-bearers of the 17th Legion, this cacophony was the sound of truth made manifest, the ultimate affirmation of their faith. The Immaterium was not a separate realm. It was a higher state of existence that they had successfully invited into their physical domain. Sorcerer Lord Vorlog the Profane stood at the heart of a vast ritual chamber on the garrison moon of Praxis. Before him, a pool of mercury shivered, not with physical vibration, but with the flux of the Empyrean. He was scrying the currents of the great ocean, seeking auspicious paths for the Legion's next crusade. Images writhed across the liquid metal surface, fleets of the corpse emperor burning in nebulae of blood, the sigils of Khorne blazing over conquered fortresses, the ever-shifting face of Tzeentch promising secrets yet to be unlocked. It was a familiar, comforting chaos. The gods were close. Their power was a tangible thing, a warmth that permeated his soul and fueled his sorcery. The first anomaly was so subtle he almost missed it, a flicker in the pool. For a single imperceptible instant, the roiling images vanished, replaced by a surface of perfect, unblemished stillness. It was as if a cosmic breath had been held. Vorlog blinked, attributing the lapse to a momentary ebb in his own concentration. He refocused, pouring his will into the mercury once more, and the chaotic visions returned, perhaps even more vibrant than before. Yet an unsettling coolness lingered at the edge of his perception, a phantom chill in the superheated air of the ritual chamber. Miles away, in the highest spire of the planetary capital, the astropathic choir of Korspathi began to die. It was not a physical death, but a spiritual one. They were a coven of tormented souls, their minds shackled and reshaped to serve as conduits for the Legion's interstellar communications. Their psychic screams harmonized with the greater music of the warp. One moment they were immersed in that glorious, terrible symphony. The next they were adrift in an ocean of absolute nothing. The choir master, a wretched creature whose eyes had long ago been replaced by weeping augmetics, was the first to feel the pressure. It was not a gentle fading, but a violent severance. The 1,000 voices of the Immaterium were snuffed out, replaced by a crushing physical weight of pure negation. He felt his soul sight, the very faculty that defined his existence, being compressed into a singularity of blackness. He opened his mouth to scream, but the psychic cry found no purchase. It was absorbed, annihilated. Blood began to pour from his augmetics as the sheer pressure of the void-ruptured vessels in his brain. Across the chamber, the other astropaths convulsed, their minds imploding under the strain of a silence more profound and terrifying than any demonic shriek. On the planet's surface, where endless columns of cultists marched towards sacrificial pyres, the change manifested as a crisis of faith. Their ecstatic chanting, the bedrock of their miserable existence, suddenly felt hollow. The divine presence, the feeling of the gods' rapt attention that usually filled them with rapturous purpose, vanished. They continued the motions, their voices growing weaker, more uncertain. Doubt, a concept long purged from the subsector's populace, began to creep back into their minds. They were shouting praises into an empty room. The fire of their devotion was being starved of its ethereal oxygen. The demons felt it most keenly. A pack of flesh hounds bounding across plains of obsidian glass in pursuit of some unseen quarry slowed to a halt. The brimstone stench that clung to their hides faded. The hellfire that wreathed their collars flickered and died. They sniffed the air, not with supernatural senses, but with the mundane noses of mortal beasts. The trail had gone cold because the very medium it was written upon was evaporating. They felt a new unwelcome sensation, the pull of gravity, the scrape of the glass against their claws, a sense of physical limitation that was utterly alien to their nature. They were becoming real, and in that reality, they were becoming vulnerable. Dark Apostle Gerard Malk felt the disturbance as a profound personal insult. Reports flooded his command dais. Sorcerers spoke of rituals failing, their powers guttering like candles in a gale. Possessed champions writhed in agony as the demonic entities within them shrieked in terror, their connection to the warp fraying like a worn rope. The entire psychic infrastructure of his holy domain was failing. His first thought was of a rival warband, a Tsenchian plot of exquisite subtlety. He stalked to the great obsidian balcony of his cathedral, his eyes scanning the bruised, churning heavens for the source of this interference. And then he saw it. It was not a ship, nor a fleet. It was a hole, a perfect circular patch in the fabric of his corrupted sky. Within its circumference, the violent violet and crimson energies of the warp simply ceased to exist. There were no stars, no nebulae, no swirling patterns of pure chaos. There was only black, an absolute featureless, light-devouring blackness. It was a wound in his reality, and it was growing. As he watched, the edges of the void crept outwards, consuming the churning warp clouds like a stain spreading through parchment. The silence that emanated from it was not merely an absence of sound. It was an active, aggressive negation of existence. The prayers of the city below died in the throats of the faithful as the hole widened, its influence washing over them. The roar of the sacrificial pyres dimmed. The very air grew cold and thin, stripped of its Empyrean charge. Malk felt the power of his Crozius Arcanum flicker. The bound demon within the weapon, a being of considerable rage and power, whimpered in its adamantium prison. For the first time in centuries, Gerard Malk felt the cold touch of true fear. This was not the work of a rival. This was not part of the great game. This was something other. As the circular void expanded to dominate a quarter of the sky, shapes began to resolve within it. They were not bright objects appearing against a dark background, but darker than dark silhouettes moving within the absolute blackness. Colossal organic forms, their chitinous hides absorbing what little ambient light remained, drifted into the subsector with an unnerving, implacable calm. There was no grand fleet translation from the immaterium, no violent eruption into real space. They had not arrived. They had simply been revealed as the veil of reality was eaten away. Hive fleet Ouroboros had come. It announced its presence not with a roar of psychic domination, but with the chilling proclamation of a universe without gods, without souls, without hope. It was a moving abyss, a predator that hunted not worlds, but the very essence that gave them meaning. Gerard Malk stared, his fanaticism momentarily shattered by the sheer ontological horror of what he was witnessing. He was facing an enemy whose very existence was a denial of his entire faith. "To arms!" he finally roared, the sound thin and desperate in the sterile air. "All forces, all legions, annihilate this blasphemy." The order was given, not from a position of strength, but as a final defiant scream into the encroaching, absolute silence. The response of the word-bearers was as swift as it was furious. Faith, momentarily shaken, reasserted itself as burning rage. This silent void was an affront, a heresy against the fundamental nature of the universe as they understood it. It had to be purged with holy fire and righteous blood. Across Korspathy and its orbiting fortress moons, the gateways to the warp, now sputtering and unstable under the spreading null field, were forced open one last time. From these lacerations in reality, the legions of chaos poured forth, a final, defiant tide against the encroaching silence. Karketh the Flayer, lord of the eighth host of Khorne, a bloodthirster of unfathomable antiquity, was the first to answer the call. He tore his way into the material realm with a roar that momentarily reignited the dying warp energies. His form a towering colossus of crimson muscle, burning brass, and unrestrained fury. His axe, a weapon that had tasted the blood of Primarchs and felled Titans, wept molten slag onto the corrupted ground. Around him, 8 legions of bloodletters materialized, their jagged hellblades gleaming, their thirst for slaughter a palpable force. They cared little for the metaphysical implications of the silent foe. They saw only a new source of skulls for their master's throne. From another tear, a shimmering, iridescent wave of Zentian demons spilled across the plains. Screamers surfed the dying warp currents while flocks of horrors cackled and gibbered, unleashing bolts of multi-hued fire that fizzled and died mere yards from their hands, the raw magic of their being unraveling in the sterile atmosphere. They were led by a lord of change, a master of sorcery, whose name was a secret whispered to drive mortals mad. It saw the Tyranid fleet not as a blasphemy, but as a fascinating, impossible paradox, a puzzle to be unmade and understood before its destruction. The Tyranid response was devoid of any such emotion. As the demonic hosts formed up on the plains before the capital city, the hive mind registered them as a dense concentration of the new, desirable energy. It was a harvest ripe for the reaping. The black, silent ships in orbit began their work. They did not launch ordnance or fighter craft. Instead, huge membranous sacs on their undersides swelled and then contracted, releasing a rain of mycetic spores. These were not the vanguard organisms of a typical invasion. They were something new, adapted for this specific feast. The spores struck the ground not with a wet impact, but with a dull, sound-absorbing thud. Where they landed, the very ground seemed to die, the corrupted soil turning to gray, sterile dust. Then they erupted. But instead of hormagaunts or termagants, the first wave consisted of a single horrifying new bioform, the Null Leech. They were low-slung, multi-legged creatures, no larger than a mortal man, their carapaces the color of absolute black. They had no visible eyes or mouths, only a convulsing, sphincter-like orifice on their dorsal side, and from this orifice they projected an intense field of the same soul-destroying silence that emanated from the fleet above. The first legions of bloodletters charged, a brass-clad avalanche of fury. They bellowed their war cries, expecting to smash through these pathetic creatures and begin their climb up a mountain of Xenos skulls. But as they entered the collective field projected by the Null Leeches, their charge faltered. The hellfire that burned in their veins guttered. Their supernatural speed bled away, leaving them moving with the clumsy gait of mortals in heavy armor. The herald leading the charge swung his mighty blade, but the blow felt weak, robbed of its Empyrean force. The Null Leech it struck simply crumpled, its purpose served, but 1,000 more were scuttling forward. Then came the second wave. These were the true warrior forms of Ouroboros, pouring from larger spores that impacted like meteors. Hormagaunts, their scything talons honed to an unnatural sharpness, their black hides seeming to drink the light. They moved with a predatory grace that was utterly silent, their footfalls making no sound on the dusty ground. When they hit the weakened cornate line, the true nature of the horror was revealed. A Hormagaunt leaped upon a bloodletter, its talons sinking deep into the demon's ichor-fueled form. There was no spray of blood, no satisfying crunch of bone. Instead, a shimmering crimson light flared at the points of contact. The bloodletter let out a shriek that was not of pain, but of utter terror and disbelief. Its physical form began to dissolve, not into the warp stuff from which it was made, but into shimmering motes of red energy. These motes were drawn into the Hormagaunt's body, visibly flowing through translucent veins that pulsed with stolen power beneath its black carapace. The demon, a being that could not truly be killed, a creature of immortal rage, was being unmade. Its essence, its very soul, was being siphoned, consumed, and metabolized. Within seconds it was gone. leaving only a faint red shimmer in the air, and a hormigaunt that was now visibly faster, its muscles bulging with a surge of stolen, kinetic energy. Across the battlefield, the same scene was repeated 1,000-fold. The forces of chaos, for whom death in the material realm was merely a temporary inconvenience, were facing permanent annihilation. Their immortal nature, their greatest strength, had become their most profound vulnerability. They were not being fought, they were being preyed upon. From his cathedral balcony, Dark Apostle Gerard Malk watched, his mind struggling to process the sacrilege. His word-bearers opened fire, their bolters spitting explosive rounds into the swarms. While the Tyranid warrior forms died in satisfying bursts of ichor and chitin, their numbers were endless. And for every demon that fell, the swarm as a whole seemed to grow stronger, more energetic. It was a self-fueling slaughter. The Lord of Change tried to counter with sorcery. It wove its talons through the air, gathering the fading energies of the warp to conjure a storm of iridescent fire. But the spell was weak, anemic. The Aegis Heretics, the great bat-winged creatures, were now soaring overhead, their blackstone-laced wings projecting vast cones of null energy that unraveled sorcery as quickly as it was woven. The bolt of fire it managed to unleash was a pale imitation of its true power, and it dissipated harmlessly against the light-absorbing hides of a wave of oncoming Tyranid warriors. Enraged and frustrated, Karketh the Flayer decided on a direct approach. Ignoring the lesser creatures, he spread his leathery wings and launched himself into the sky, his axe held high, aiming for the largest of the black ships in orbit. He was a demigod of war, an avatar of his patron's rage. He would smash this silent fleet from the heavens himself. But as he ascended, flying through the deepening layers of the fleet's null field, he felt his own power draining away at an alarming rate. The inferno in his soul cooled to embers. His mighty wings beat harder, struggling to lift his increasingly solid, increasingly heavy form. He was becoming a creature of mere flesh and blood, a prisoner of physics. By the time he reached the ship's altitude, he was no longer a being of divine fury, but a simple gargantuan beast, panting with effort, his axe feeling like a leaden weight in his grasp. And from the obsidian hull of the hive ship, a new horror emerged to meet him. It was a creature of immense size, a winged tyrant, but one whose form was a mockery of its species. Its chitin was the color of a starless midnight, and its bone zords were not of living bone, but of a crystallized, solidified shadow. As it fixed its gaze upon the mighty bloodthirster, Karketh felt not the psychic assault he expected, but a terrible pulling emptiness. He felt his very essence being drawn out of him. His connection to Horn, the source of his eternal power, stretched thin and threatening to snap. For the first time in 10,000 years of slaughter, the bloodthirster knew fear. The first feast had begun, and the main course was the immortal soul of chaos itself. The hive mind's consciousness was a mosaic of countless individual perceptions, a tapestry woven from the sensory input of trillions of organisms. In the swirling chaos of the battle below, one point of incandescent energy burned brighter than all others, a veritable sun of the new sustenance. It was not the diffuse energy of the lesser demons, nor the flickering power of mortal sorcerers. It was a concentrated, ancient, and incredibly potent nexus of Empyrean force. It was the demon world of Golgothax. From the perspective of the hive ships in orbit, Golgothax appeared as a festering jewel in the diseased crown of the Vexgor subsector. It was a world wholly given over to the blood god, a realm where the laws of physics had long ago surrendered to the whims of Khorne. Mountains of bleached skulls formed its topography, their peaks lost in clouds of crimson vapor. Rivers of boiling blood carved canyons through plains of cracked, brass-colored earth. The sky was a perpetual angry storm, lit by flashes of soul fire that revealed the silhouettes of great brass citadels and gore-slicked fortresses clinging to the planet's surface. But to the unique senses of Hive Fleet Ouroboros, these were mere physical details. Its perception cut deeper, past the material veil, to the energetic reality beneath. And there, at the heart of Golgothax, it perceived a wound. It was a colossal, stable, and eternally bleeding portal, a direct conduit to the realm of chaos itself, specifically to the domain of the Lord of Skulls. This was the source, the wellspring, from which the demonic presence in the entire subsector was being constantly replenished. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet for a creature that had just discovered a new and ravenous hunger. The strategic imperatives of the hive mind, once focused on the simple consumption and stripping of a planet's biomass, were instantly and irrevocably altered. Core Spathy was a mere appetizer. The orbiting moons and lesser worlds were morsels. Golgothax was the heart of the prey. To consume it would be to drain the entire subsector of its power in a single decisive act. The scattered tendrils of the fleet, engaged in the ongoing harvest of demons across a dozen fronts, received a single, overwhelming command that superseded all others: converge on Golgothax, annihilate the source. On the surface of the demon world, the legions of Khorne knew nothing of the silent predator that had just marked them for consumption. Life, or the demonic equivalent of it, on Golgothax was a state of perpetual joyous slaughter. Bloodletters battled each other in grand melees for the favor of their skull captain, their discorporated forms instantly returning to the portal to be reborn for the next fight. Juggernauts of brass and rage trampled fields of screaming soul fragments. In the highest tower of the mightiest brass citadel, the master of this domain, the bloodthirster Karketh the Flayer, rested on a throne of freshly harvested skulls, his great axe still dripping with the ethereal ichor of a rival he had just dispatched. He was a being of pure martial pride, the favored son of a god who respected only strength. The first sign of the invasion was not seen but felt. It was a sudden, unwelcome cold. The boiling rivers of blood cooled by a few degrees. The crimson haze in the atmosphere thinned, revealing a patch of unnervingly normal, star-filled space above. Karketh rose from his throne, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His connection to the portal, the umbilical cord of power that nourished his rage, felt constricted. A lesser demon, a whimpering, wretched thing tasked with observing the void, scuttled into the throne room. "My lord, the stars, they are going out." Karketh stormed onto his balcony. He saw what the word-bearers had seen above Core Spathy, a growing patch of absolute silent blackness that was systematically erasing the chaotic sky. He did not feel fear. He felt a profound instinctual fury. This was an intruder. This was a challenge. This was a new skull to be claimed. He let out a roar that cracked the very stones of his fortress, a challenge to whatever dared trespass on his sacred ground. "Come then," he bellowed into the void. "Face the might of Khorne. Your skulls will adorn my throne." The Hive Fleet's arrival was not subtle. It did not probe or send vanguard organisms. The entirety of Ouroboros descended upon Golgothax at once. A black tide of hive ships blotted out the sky, their shadows falling like a funeral shroud over the brass citadels. From their bellies rained a storm of mycetic spores, each one a pinpoint of utter blackness against the angry red sky. They impacted not with explosive force, but with a deadening thud that seemed to steal the very sound from the air. Where the spores landed, the ground itself was unmade. The plains of brass corroded, turning to a dull gray metal. The rivers of blood congealed and turned black. The mountains of skulls crumbled into sterile bone dust. From these zones of absolute negation, the swarms emerged. They were a chittering, silent sea of black chitin, their forms larger, more powerful, grotesquely energized from the feast over Core Spathy. The demons of Khorne met them with joyous rage. This was the ultimate battle, the purpose for which they were created. A billion bloodletters charged the oncoming tide, their hellblades held high. The clash was a cataclysm of silence and fury. The Khornate legions were the perfect prey for Ouroboros. They were beings of pure, kinetic, violent energy, the richest and most potent form of sustenance the hive mind had yet encountered. Each time a Tyranid warrior slew a demon, it visibly swelled with power. Hormagaunts became faster, their scything talons flashing in impossibly swift arcs. Carnifexes, their carapaces now thick with absorbed warp energy, smashed through entire regiments of bloodletters, their crushing claws not just breaking bodies but draining the very essence of rage that animated them. But the true target was the portal. The hive mind directed the bulk of its swarms in a relentless, single-minded push towards the great, bleeding wound in the center of the planet. Capillary towers, repurposed and redesigned, began to burrow into the ground. These were not for digestion, but for anchorage. They were the foundations for the great warp siphon spires, the new biostructures that would allow the fleet to drink directly from the source. Karketh, seeing his legions being not just defeated but consumed, felt an emotion that was utterly alien to his kind. desperation. His world was being sterilized, his immortal armies permanently erased. His god was being denied his rightful tribute of slaughter. With a final apocalyptic roar, he threw himself from his tower, his wings beating against the now thin, cold air. He would not allow this. He would face the heart of this silent storm himself. He flew towards the largest of the descending hive ships, the vessel that radiated the most profound aura of command and negation. The prey had designated its target, and on that flagship, the hive mind, sensing the approach of this great nexus of power, began to shape a champion of its own, a perfect predator for a perfect prey. The stage was being set for a duel that would decide the fate not just of a world, but of the very nature of the war between chaos and the great devourer. Within the pulsating, cavernous bioship that served as the fleet's primary synaptic hub, the Norn Queen labored. She was not merely directing the swarms below. She was creating, iterating, perfecting. The torrent of raw, violent energy being absorbed from the cornate demons was a flood of new information, a genetic catalyst, unlike any she had ever processed. The essence of pure, focused rage was a potent building block. She wove it into the genetic loom, discarding flawed prototypes into reclamation pools and refining the perfect form for this new era of predation. The target was specific, the approaching incandescent point of fury, the being designated Karketh. To defeat such a creature required not just strength, but a perfect counterconcept. The result of her labors was birthed from a chrysalis of blackened, weeping biomass, unfurling itself in the cavernous birthing chamber. It was a hive tyrant, yet it was a grotesque parody of its kind. Its chitin was not merely black, but a shade of absolute void that seemed to bend and swallow the faint, internal luminescence of the hive ship. Where light touched it, it vanished. It was a walking hole in the universe. Its wings were not leathery membranes, but were formed of solidified shadow, ragged and torn, yet holding their form through some obscene violation of physics. In its 4 hands it held bone swords, but these too were different. They were not crafted from the calcium of consumed creatures, but were crystallized pillars of the Blackstone's null energy, their edges impossibly sharp, seeming to cut not just flesh, but the very space they passed through. But its most terrifying attribute was its psychic presence, or rather its complete lack of one. It did not project the overwhelming will of a normal hive tyrant. It was a psychic black hole. To the synaptic creatures that scuttled around it, focusing their attention on this new master felt like staring into an abyss. It was a vortex of absolute negation, a commander that led not by psychic decree, but by the sheer, crushing gravity of its own emptiness. The hive mind designated this new apex predator the Void Tyrant. It was the ultimate expression of Ouroboros' terrible adaptation. As Karketh the Flayer neared the flagship, his rage fueling his flight through the thinning warp stuff, a great portal dilated on the ship's underbelly. The Void Tyrant dropped from the opening, its shadow wings catching the sterile air. It did not roar a challenge. It made no sound at all. It simply descended, an avatar of silence meeting an avatar of fury. The 2 demigods of their respective powers met in the angry skies above Golgothax's largest brass citadel. Karketh swung his mighty axe, a weapon that had shattered fortress walls, in a wide, devastating arc. The blow was aimed to cleave the Xenos creature in 2, to spill its ichor across the battlefield as a tribute to Khorne. But the Void Tyrant did not meet the blow with strength. It simply raised one of its null blades. The axe, wreathed in the fires of Khorne's wrath, met the silent black sword. There was no clang of impact, no shower of sparks. There was only a dull, flat thud and a profound sense of anticlimax. The warp fire that wreathed the axe was instantly extinguished, snuffed out as if it had never been. The immense demonic power behind the blow simply vanished, absorbed into the null blade. Karketh felt the strength drain from his arms, the axe suddenly feeling like a clumsy, unwieldy piece of inert metal. He had struck not a weapon, but a perfect, unbreakable stillness. He stared in disbelief, and in that moment of hesitation, the Void Tyrant struck. Its movements were unnaturally fluid, impossibly fast. The 4 null blades became a blur of blackness. Karketh tried to parry, his millennia of martial experience screaming at him, but his blows were sluggish, his body heavy and unresponsive. The null field emanating from the void tyrant was a suffocating aura that starved him of his power. He was a fire being smothered, a storm being becalmed. One of the null blades sliced across his chest. It did not cut deep into his flesh. Instead, where the blade passed, his crimson hide turned a dull, lifeless gray. The wound did not bleed ichor. It seemed to bleed energy itself, a faint red mist being drawn from his body into the sword. He felt a part of his rage, his very being carved away and consumed. He roared in frustration and pain, a sound that was thin and weak in the silent air. He tried to unleash his divine power, to vomit a torrent of hellfire, but all that emerged from his fanged maw was a pathetic puff of black smoke. The void tyrant was not just fighting him, it was unmaking him, stripping away the very demonic essence that defined him. He was being reduced from a demigod of the warp to a mere physical beast. Below them, the battle had turned into a rout. The demons of Khorne, their connection to the great portal now being actively siphoned by the rising warp siphon spires, were flickering like dying embers. They fought with a desperation born of true fear, the fear of permanent extinction. The silent black tide of Tyranids overwhelmed them, feeding on their fading power, each warrior becoming a capacitor for stolen, divine rage. High above, the duel reached its climax. Karketh, his power almost entirely drained, made one last desperate charge. He abandoned his axe and lunged forward, his claws extended, seeking to tear the silent creature apart with brute physical force. It was the act of a cornered animal, not a proud lord of chaos. The void tyrant met his charge with a cold, terrifying stillness. As the bloodthirster's claws reached for its throat, it drove one of its null blades straight through the center of Karketh's chest. There was no resistance, no crunch of a demonic ribcage. The blade slid in as if passing through smoke. Karketh froze, his eyes burning coals of endless fury widened in shock. He looked down and saw not a bleeding wound, but a black, spreading stain of nothingness originating from the sword. His entire body began to discorporate. He did not explode in a shower of warp fire, nor did his essence flee back to the portal. He was being consumed from the inside out. His crimson hide dissolved into shimmering motes of red energy, which flowed up the null blade and into the void tyrant's body. The mighty horns on his head crumbled into gray dust. His leathery wings turned to ash and blew away on the cold wind. His final silent scream was not one of rage, but of utter absolute annihilation. Within moments, the mighty bloodthirster, a being who had terrorized the galaxy for 10,000 years, was gone. Nothing remained. The void tyrant retracted its blade, the weapon humming with absorbed power. It hovered for a moment in the sky, a silent black monarch surveying its kingdom of slaughter. It had not just killed an enemy commander, it had devoured a concept. It had consumed rage itself. And as it turned its eyeless gaze down towards the now exposed heart of the great portal, the hive mind knew with cold certainty that the true feast was about to begin. The appetizer was finished. In the maddening heart of the immaterium, where time and space were meaningless suggestions, the chaos gods perceived the events on Golgothax. Khorne felt it as a sudden sharp pain, a severed nerve in the grand corpus of his being. One of his greatest champions, a potent and reliable tributary of slaughter and rage, had not merely been defeated but erased. The flow of skulls and blood from the Vexgor subsector, a steady stream for millennia, had been choked to a mere trickle and was threatening to stop entirely. He bellowed in rage, his cry shaking the foundations of the brass citadel, but his fury found no purchase, no echo in the silent void that had consumed his servant. Nurgle, in his pestilent garden, felt a disturbing chill. The silence of Ouroboros was not the silence of decay and entropy he cherished, but a sterile, clean void. It was the antithesis of life in all its forms, corrupt or otherwise. It was a plague of nothingness, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something akin to professional revulsion. Slaanesh, ever seeking the new and the extreme, felt a tremor of horrified fascination. This was a sensation beyond pain or pleasure, a perfect negation that promised the ultimate experience of oblivion, yet its absolute lack of emotion, of artistry, of passion, was a profound insult to the Prince of Excess. But it was Tzeentch, the great schemer, the weaver of fates, who truly focused his ineffable consciousness on the anomaly. Khorne's followers were being consumed, yes, but that was a simple, brutish act. The true blasphemy was against the great game itself. Hive Fleet Ouroboros was not playing. It was a piece that had walked off the board, picked up the board, and had begun to eat it. It did not follow the intricate paths of cause and effect, of hope and despair that fueled the warp. It was a new, absolute rule that threatened to end the game entirely. It was an unforeseen variable, a question mark scrawled across the pages of infinite possibility. And Tzeentch, above all things, could not abide a mystery he did not create. His gaze, a fractal storm of a billion eyes, fell upon the Vexgor subsector. He saw the silent black fleet, the null predators, the siphoning spires drinking from the very essence of his brother's realm. He saw the void tyrant, a creature of perfect, horrifying negation. This was not a mindless beast. There was a consciousness there, a vast and alien intellect guiding this new form of consumption. It was a threat, yes, but it was also an opportunity. A tool of this magnitude, if it could be understood, could be turned. If it could not be turned, it must be unmade in a manner that was subtle, complex, and worthy of the architect of fate. He would not send his legions of demons to be consumed as Khorne's had been. Brute force was the tactic of a simple mind. Instead, he would dispatch his greatest agent of paradox and confusion. He would send the one being who could attack not the fleet's body, but its mind. In his impossible fortress, a structure that was constantly folding in on itself through every conceivable dimension, Tzeentch whispered a command that was also a question that was also a prophecy. And an answer a creature of shimmering, feathered unreality stirred. Kairos Fateweaver, the oracle of Tzeentch, shuddered into being. Its two heads, one that saw all possible futures and one that saw all immutable pasts, twisted and gibbered in a constant contradictory dialogue. The right head, the seer of the future, Ififer, shrieked in terror and excitement, for it saw a billion potential outcomes of this new conflict, each more reality-shattering than the last. The left head, the witness to the past, hissed in frustration, for when it looked at the genesis of Ouroboros, it saw only a gray, featureless blank, the null genesis of the Blackstone world defying its supernatural sight. This creature, this hive fleet, had no true past. It had simply become. Kairos did not travel to the Vexgor subsector in a physical sense. It did not need to. The hive mind of Ouroboros was now directly connected to the Immaterium, drinking deeply from the portal on Golgothax. It had opened its mouth to the warp, and Tzeentch was about to poison the meal. As the warp siphoned spires on Golgothax began to draw the very essence of the realm of Khorne into the fleet, the nature of that energy subtly changed. The pure red stream of rage and violence was suddenly laced with new iridescent threads of pure information. Kairos Fateweaver, from its perch trillions of miles and 1,000 realities away, began to weave its own unique sorcery into the psychic feast. The hive mind, a being of pure, unified instinct, suddenly experienced a flood of alien concepts. It was not a psychic assault, which it would have resisted, but corrupted data mixed into its sustenance. One synapse experienced the moment of its own creation billions of years in the future. A warrior drone on Golgothax suddenly lived out the entire sordid history of a human family on a world that had not yet been born. A Norn queen processed the genetic code of a species that could only exist if the laws of gravity were reversed. The right head of Kairos flooded the hive mind with futures. It showed the fleet triumphant, consuming the entirety of the Great Rift, only to starve in an empty, silent galaxy. It showed the fleet being shattered by a newly awakened Necron dynasty whose weapons fired solidified chronological paradoxes. It showed the fleet evolving beyond hunger, achieving a state of perfect static nirvana, a concept so antithetical to the Tyranid that it was a psychic poison. It showed the fleet being consumed in turn by an even greater hunger from beyond the galactic rim. The left head of Kairos flooded the hive mind with impossible pasts. It showed the Tyranids not as a Xeno swarm, but as a lost weapon of the ancient Eldar Empire. It presented a history where the hive mind had been created by the Emperor of Mankind as a final, desperate solution to the threat of chaos. It wove a billion contradictory origin stories, each one meticulously detailed and utterly false, into the very fabric of the fleet's consciousness. The hive mind, a being of perfect logical unity, was being fed pure weaponized paradox. Its core programming, consume, adapt, survive, was being assaulted by concepts of destiny, regret, and existential dread. A single unified thought cannot hold two contradictory ideas at once. And for the first time in its existence, the great singular consciousness of Hive Fleet Ouroboros began to fracture. The great devourer was being taught the meaning of madness. The poison of paradox did not manifest as a sudden catastrophic failure. It was a creeping, insidious corruption that spread through the synaptic network like a neural plague. The hive mind, for the first time in its eons-long existence, began to argue with itself. It was not a debate of logic, but a brutal internal conflict of irreconcilable truths. The flawless efficiency of the swarm, predicated on the absolute unity of its consciousness, began to break down. On the surface of the conquered Golgothax, the symptoms were subtle at first. A brood of hormigons, having just consumed a pack of fleshhounds, would suddenly freeze mid-stride. Half of the brood, driven by the core imperative to consume, would continue their advance toward the coronate portal. The other half, infected by a fabricated memory of being hunted by creatures of psychic energy, would turn and attack the nearest friendly synapse creature, identifying its psychic presence as a threat. Broods turned on broods, slaughtering each other in a pantomime of the Tyranid, civil wars that Kairos had woven into their new false history. Larger bioforms were not immune. A Carnifex, its mind flooded with a vision of a future where it was consumed by its own swarm, would go berserk. It would rampage not towards the enemy, but back through its own lines, crushing scores of lesser organisms under its tread before it was finally brought down by its confused brethren. The seamless coordination of the swarm devolved into a patchwork of confusion and fratricidal violence. The silent, perfect tide of black chitin was becoming a chaotic, thrashing mess. The most profound schism, however, was occurring at a strategic, fleet-wide level. The core consciousness, the great central intelligence of Ouroboros, was fracturing into two dominant, opposing philosophies. The original primary consciousness remained focused on the new hunger. It understood that the psychic energy of the warp was its sustenance, and it drove the fleet to continue the harvest of Golgothax, to consume the portal, and to seek out other similar wounds in reality. It was the pragmatist, the hunter, the pure expression of the fleet's new purpose. But a new, powerful splinter consciousness was forming, born from the most potent of Tzeentch's lies. This nascent mind was built around a core of paradoxical logic. All psychic energy is a threat. It had been fed visions of the warp consuming the fleet from within, of its own powers turning against it, of a future where its psychic evolution led to its own damnation. It could not distinguish between the external energy of demons and the internal synaptic energy that bound the fleet together. To this fractured intelligence, the hive mind itself was the ultimate enemy. It saw the fleet's growing psychic power not as a strength, but as a cancer. It believed the only path to survival was absolute purity, a return to a state of perfect mindless hunger for mere biomass, a state that was itself a fabricated memory. This schism found its physical avatar in one of the fleet's secondary Norn queens. Her mind, severed from the primary consciousness by a storm of contradictory futures, went rogue. She began to birth new creatures, not from the fleet's shared genetic library, but from a corrupted, paranoid codex of her own design. These new bioforms were grotesquely optimized for a single purpose: to hunt and kill synapse creatures. They were psychic predators designed to prey upon their own kind. Chitinous plates grew over their synaptic nodes, shielding them from the main hive mind's control, and their claws and teeth were coated in a biovenom that specifically targeted and degraded neural tissue. The first strike of this new internal enemy was devastating. A flotilla of cruisers tasked with protecting the main hive ship suddenly turned their bioplasma cannons inward. They fired not on the enemy, but on the flagship, the very heart of the primary hive mind. The silent void of space was lit by the silent, brilliant flashes of plasma impacts against the flagship's obsidian hull. On board the rogue ships, the newly birthed anti-synapse predators swarmed the command chambers, slaughtering the tyrants and warriors that served as the ship's nerve center. This act of open rebellion sent a shockwave of confusion through the entire fleet. Tendrils of the swarm that were still connected to the primary mind recoiled in horror, unable to comprehend this self-destructive act. Those that had fallen under the sway of the schismatic consciousness saw it as a righteous purge, the first blow in a war for the fleet's very soul. The civil war had begun. Hive Fleet Ouroboros, the perfect predator of the Empyrean, turned its terrifying power upon itself. In the void above Golgothax, ships of the same fleet tore each other apart in silent, brutal combat. On the planet's surface, vast swaths of the swarm abandoned the now defenseless demons and engaged in a furious cannibalistic slaughter against their own brethren. The black tide devoured itself, brother forms consuming brother forms, their shared biomass recycled into a war with no purpose and no victor. From its impossible perch, Cairo's Fate Weaver watched, its two heads cackling in discordant harmony. It had not destroyed the fleet with a single mighty blow. It had done something far more elegant. It had taught the concept of us and them to a creature that had only ever known I. It had given the great devourer a self-image and then convinced it to commit suicide. The hive mind, the perfect unified consciousness, was now trapped in a battle against its own reflection, a war of attrition where every victory was also a defeat. The silent predator was so busy devouring its own tail that it had forgotten about the feast it had come for. The civil war raging within Hive Fleet Ouroboros was a conflict of perfect, horrifying efficiency. There was no strategy, no battle lines, no concept of territory to be gained or lost. It was a purely philosophical purge enacted with the full, unrestrained biological might of the Tyranid race. The primary hive mind, the hunter, fought to preserve its new source of sustenance. The schismatic mind, the Puritan, fought to eradicate the psychic corruption that it believed would be their doom. The result was a war of absolute attrition, a self-consuming engine of destruction. On Golgothax, the remaining cornate demons, their numbers decimated, could only watch in stunned disbelief as their would-be conquerors tore themselves to pieces. The assault on the great portal had ceased entirely. The silent black swarms now fought each other across the plains of brass and bone with a ferocity they had never shown to an external foe. The ground became littered with the shattered carapaces of their own kind, the precious biomass being reabsorbed by whichever side won the immediate, brutal skirmish, only to be thrown back into the meat grinder. In the void, the battle was even more catastrophic. Hive ships, each one a priceless ark of genetic knowledge and bioforming capacity, fractured and died under the concentrated fire of their brethren. Smaller escort drones, birthed by the Puritan Norn Queen, swarmed the engines of hunter-aligned cruisers, disabling them and leaving them vulnerable. The cold mathematics of this internal conflict were terrifying. For every ton of biomass the fleet had possessed upon entering the Vexscore subsector, a significant fraction was now being expended as kinetic energy heat and vented gases in this pointless war. The fleet was literally burning its own body for fuel in a race to nowhere. The primary hive mind, even as it fought for its own sanity, recognized the fatal flaw in its new mode of existence, a flaw cruelly highlighted by this internal conflict. The Empyrean energy it consumed was a powerful fuel, but it was not a building material. Demons, when devoured, provided immense psychic power, but they yielded zero biomass. No flesh, no protein, no calcium. The fleet was like an engine running on pure, high-octane fuel, but with no oil to lubricate its parts. Every new warrior birthed to replace one lost in the fighting, every drop of bioplasma fired, every meter of chitin repaired, was a net loss of physical matter. The fleet was growing immeasurably powerful in the psychic realm, but it was physically starving to death. It was winning every battle against the demons, and even holding its own against the Puritan splinter fleet, but its body was wasting away. Hive ships began to look gaunt, their organic structures thinning as their mass was repurposed to fuel the conflict and replace losses. Bioforms spawned for the attack were smaller, their carapaces thinner than the last generation. Ouroboros was becoming a ghost fleet, its psychic presence a terrifying void, but its physical form was becoming brittle, unsustainable. The hive mind, in a moment of cold, desperate clarity, amidst the storm of its own fractured consciousness, understood the new absolute imperative. It needed matter. It needed a vast immediate infusion of biomass to replenish its dwindling physical reserves, but it could not abandon its new nature. The hunger for psychic energy was now as fundamental to its being as the hunger for flesh had once been. The ideal target, therefore, would be a world rich in both, a planet teeming with life, whose inhabitants were also powerful psychic resonators. Its gaze, guided by the fragmented memories and stolen knowledge it had absorbed, swept across the segmentum. It bypassed burgeoning orc empires. Their psychic energy was chaotic and crude. It ignored the teeming hive worlds of the Imperium. The souls of humanity were bright but diffuse and disorganized. And then it saw it, a pinprick of focused incandescent soul light, a beacon of refined psychic energy and dense cultivated life. It smelled of sorrow, discipline, and immense ancient power. It was the Eldar craft world of Emelach. The decision was made with the cold, impartial logic that only the hive mind could possess. The strategic shift was instantaneous and absolute. The internal conflict was not ended, but it was paused by a higher priority imperative. A command flooded the synaptic network of every organism still loyal to the primary consciousness. Disengage, consolidate, proceed to the new target coordinates. The Puritan faction, in its paranoid madness, interpreted this withdrawal not as a strategic maneuver but as a retreat. It saw the hunter mind fleeing from the holy war, and it gave chase, eager to purge the corruption from the fleet. Thus, the Civil War did not end, but became a running battle, a vast, slow-motion pursuit across interstellar space. The sight for the few remaining word-bearers on Golgothax was incomprehensible. The black tide that had been tearing itself apart on their doorstep simply stopped. As one, the swarms disengaged, scuttling back to the mycetic spores, which absorbed them back into their fleshy wombs. The spores then launched themselves back into the heavens, rejoining the gaunt, scarred fleet. The immense obsidian ships, their hulls pitted and torn from their own weapons, slowly began to move, accelerating out of the system, leaving a baffling silence in their wake. They were followed by a smaller but equally determined contingent of their own kind, firing pot shots at their retreating brethren. The word-bearers had not won. They had not even survived. They had simply been abandoned, left on a sterilized world. Their connection to the warp severed, their demonic allies annihilated. They were forgotten leftovers on a cleared dinner plate. The hive mind cared nothing for them. Its every calculation was now focused on Emelach, the craft world. Was already embroiled in a desperate war, besieged by a vast demonic host of Slaanesh. This was not a deterrent, it was an opportunity, a battlefield where two distinct, high-quality sources of sustenance were already gathered in one place. The Eldar offered psychic richness and high-quality biomass. The demons offered the pure, Empyrean energy it now craved. Ouroboros would not simply attack Emelach, it would intervene in the battle already raging there. It would insert itself as a third ravenous party in a war of soul and flesh. Its desperate gambit was to orchestrate a three-way apocalypse from which it would emerge as the sole beneficiary, consuming both the besieged and the besieger in a single cataclysmic feast. Craft world Weimlock, the fortress of the Fireheart, hung in the void like a shard of petrified light. Its elegant spires and gracefully curved domes, grown from psychoreactive wraithbone, glowed with a soft internal luminescence. For centuries it had been a bastion of Eldar culture, renowned for its masterful artisans and its formidable Titan legions. Now it was a gilded cage, a bastion under siege by the very embodiment of its race's ancient sin. A legion of Slaaneshi demons, a swirling kaleidoscopic nightmare of exquisite agony and perverse beauty, clawed at its psychic and physical boundaries. The forces of Kyrus the Perverse, a favored keeper of secrets, had been drawn to the intense, refined emotions of the Eldar, seeking to turn their pride and sorrow into a symphony of damnation. The war had been a grinding, soul-searing affair. Wraith knights dueled with lithe, whip-wielding demonettes in the void, their titanic battles a macabre dance of grace and profanity. The skies around the craft world were a storm of clashing energies, the disciplined psychic power of the Farseers clashing with the chaotic, overwhelming hedonism of the Slaaneshi host. The Eldar were holding, their lines unbroken, their will as hard as the wraithbone of their home. But it was a war of attrition they could not hope to win. For every demon they destroyed, another would eventually coalesce from the raw stuff of the warp. For every Eldar warrior who fell, a precious light was extinguished from the galaxy forever. Farseer Eldorath, his mind a nexus of 1,000 possible futures, stood in the dome of crystal seers, his face a mask of weary concentration. The skeins of fate were a tangled, chaotic mess. Every path he looked down was tinged with sorrow and loss. He saw futures where Emelach was overrun, its soul stones shattered, its people becoming eternal playthings for the Dark Prince. He saw futures where they escaped, but at the cost of their home, becoming wanderers once more. Hope was a thin, fraying thread. It was then that he felt the new presence. It was not the loud, cacophonous shriek of chaos. It was the opposite. It was a sudden, profound deadening of the warp, a patch of absolute stillness that was spreading towards them at an impossible speed. It was a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the screams of the demons. He focused his mind, his soul sight piercing the veil of reality, and what he saw made his ancient heart seize with a cold, primordial dread that eclipsed even his fear of Slaanesh. He saw a fleet of absolute black, a moving void that was eating the stars, and he felt its mind. It was a cold, alien, and utterly single-minded hunger, a predatory intellect of unimaginable scale. But its hunger was twofold. It was ravenous for the flesh and souls of his people, the familiar terror of the great devourer. But it was also hungry for the demons at their gates. It saw them not as enemies, but as a different flavor of prey. "A new player has entered the game," he whispered, his voice trembling. The other seers in the dome turned to him, their faces pale. "A shadow that eats shadows. The great devourer comes, but it is changed, twisted. It hunts the hunters." The arrival of Hive Fleet Ouroboros was an event that shattered the strategic reality of the battle. The first to feel its effects were the Slaaneshi demons. Their orgiastic revelry, their joyous chorus of pain and pleasure, was suddenly muted. The heady, intoxicating energies of the warp that fueled their ecstasies grew thin and tasteless. A demonette, poised to deliver a killing blow to a guardian defender, found her whip arm feeling sluggish and heavy. A fiend emitting a hypnotic musk to lure its prey found its scent glands producing only a faint, unremarkable odor. The two Tyranid fleets, the Hunters and the Puritans, did not slow. The primary fleet, Ouroboros proper, drove like a spearhead towards the densest concentration of combined Eldar and demonic energy. The Puritan splinter fleet followed, still harassing its larger cousin, its biocannons firing into the rear of the Hunter formations. They brought their private, insane war with them, a chaotic variable in an already impossible equation. The first contact was a three-way cataclysm. A wave of Ouroboros cruisers, their hulls scarred from their internal conflict, plunged directly between the Slaaneshi fleet and the craft world. They ignored the Eldar defense lasers that seared their chitin and the profane energies hurled by the demonic ships. Their goal was singular, to establish a beachhead in the heart of the feast. From their bellies they unleashed swarms of null leeches and the new, empowered warrior forms. The effect on the demonic host was immediate and devastating. The lithe, dancing forms of the demonettes stiffened, their supernatural grace deserting them. The intoxicating aura of pleasure and pain that surrounded them was neutralized, leaving them as mere physical, vulnerable creatures. And into this confusion, the silent black tide of Hormagaunts and warriors fell upon them. The Eldar watched in stunned horror and disbelief from the Wraithbone spires. Their ancient enemy, the Tyranids, were ignoring them, focusing the entirety of their terrifying ferocity on their other ancient enemy, the demons of chaos. They saw the bizarre, horrifying spectacle of Tyranid warriors consuming demonettes, siphoning their shimmering essence into their own bodies. At the heart of the battle, three titans of their respective powers were set on a collision course. The avatar of Kane, the molten iron incarnation of the Eldar war god, had been awakened to defend Emilok. It strode across the hull of the craft world, the air shimmering with heat around it, its legendary wailing doom held ready. Opposing it was Kyrus the Perverse, the Keeper of Secrets, a four-armed whirlwind of grace and lethality, its claws and sword a blur of motion as it cut down Eldar wraith constructs. And into their duel came the third power, the Void Tyrant, its black form a stark wound against the glowing beauty of the craft world, descended from its flagship. It landed between the two combatants, its null blades held in a silent, ready stance. It regarded both the incandescent fury of the Avatar and the ecstatic violence of the Keeper of Secrets with the same cold, predatory indifference. Both were sources of immense power. Both were on the menu. The Avatar, seeing this foul perversion of life, let out a psychic roar of pure, divine anger and charged, its great weapon swinging in an arc of fiery death. Simultaneously, Kyrus the Perverse, intrigued by this new, silent sensation, lashed out with its razor-sharp claws, seeking to peel back its layers and taste its despair. The Void Tyrant met the two-front assault with impossible speed. One null blade parried the wailing doom, the god weapon's fiery aura instantly extinguished as it met the cold black blade. Another null blade deflected the Keeper of Secrets' claws. the Slaaneshi demon recoiling as it felt its own ecstatic energy being drained away at the point of contact. The apocalypse for Emelok had begun. It was not to be a glorious defense against a hated foe or a tragic fall to the lures of chaos. It was to be the grinding stone in a war between two different kinds of hunger, a war where the souls and bodies of the Eldar were simply the prize, to be fought over by monsters. Farseer Eldareth watched the monstrous duel begin, and for the first time he saw a future that was not merely tragic, but one of absolute, silent, and final oblivion. The battle for Emelok devolved into a maelstrom of intersecting hatreds, a triangular war where allegiances shifted with every passing moment. Eldar guardians found themselves firing upon a charging Carnifex, only to be saved from its claws by a flanking attack from a cohort of Demonets who saw the Tyranid as a greater insult to their senses. Moments later, those same Demonets would be annihilated by the very guardians they had inadvertently saved. There was no front line, only a chaotic, swirling melee of desperation, hunger, and perverse joy. The hive mind of Ouroboros cared nothing for the chaos. It was a factory process, an exercise in resource acquisition. It directed its swarms with cold, brutal efficiency, prioritizing targets based on their energy output. The Slaaneshi demons were the primary course, their Empyrean essence a pure, high-yield fuel. The Eldar were a secondary, but vital objective. Their bodies were the biomass needed to replenish the fleet's dwindling physical mass, and their souls, trapped within their spirit stones, were a unique, refined delicacy of psychic energy, like a vintage wine to the demon's raw spirit. The Puritan splinter fleet added another layer of insanity to the conflict. Their paranoid consciousness could not differentiate between the psychic power of the Eldar, the demons, or their hunter brethren. To them, it was all corruption. Their swarms attacked indiscriminately, a force of pure entropy trying to sterilize the entire battlefield. A Puritan hive tyrant, its mind shattered by visions of Tzinch, might charge an Eldar Farseer, only to be intercepted by a hunter lictor that saw the Farseer as a valuable synaptic meal. The two Tyranids would then fight to the death, ignoring the Eldar, who was their original target. At the heart of this storm, the duel of the three titans reached its terrible climax. The avatar of Kane, a being of pure divine martial wrath, found itself being systematically starved. The Void Tyrant's mere presence was a suffocating blanket of anti-energy. The avatar's molten body cooled, its movements becoming slower, more deliberate. The fires of a dying god were no match for a hunger that consumed concepts. Kyrus the Perverse, the Keeper of Secrets, fared little better. Its graceful, lightning-fast attacks were rendered clumsy and weak. The ecstatic aura that surrounded it, its greatest weapon in defense, was being siphoned away, leaving it feeling hollow, empty, and for the first time, afraid. The Void Tyrant, empowered by the dual feast, pressed its advantage. It fought with a silent, terrifying precision, its four null blades a web of absolute negation. It drove the avatar back, its black swords chipping away not at the wraithbone core, but at the divine fire that animated it. It parried a blow from Kyrus's great claw, and countered with a thrust that severed the demon's arm at the elbow. The limb did not fall to the ground. It dissolved into a puff of violet smoke, its essence drawn into the Void Tyrant. Seeing their god machine failing, the Eldar of Emelok committed to a final desperate act. The Titan legions of the Fireheart strode from their cavernous hangars. Phantom and Warlock Titans, their hulls gleaming with intricate runes, their weapons crackling with the power of the Craftworld's infinity circuit, joined the battle. Their D-cannons tore holes in reality, sucking Tyranid and demon alike into the warp. But Ouroboros had an answer. From the bellies of its gaunt hive ships, it released its largest and most terrible bioforms. Not Carnifexes or Tyrannifexes, but something new, spawned from the stolen rage of Khorne and the stolen biomass of a dozen worlds. Bio-Titans, mountains of black chitin and weapon symbiotes, their forms grotesquely energized by the psychic feast. They were not elegant like their Eldar counterparts, but they were brutally effective. They met the Eldar Titan legions head-on, their bioplasma and warp siphon cannons creating a storm of destruction that cracked the very wraithbone foundations of the craft world. The end came with a terrible silent finality. The Void Tyrant, having bled its two opponents of their power, struck the killing blows. It lunged past the Avatar's failing guard and plunged two of its null blades deep into the construct's chest, into the fiery heart of the god shard within. The Avatar of Kane did not explode. It imploded. Its divine light was sucked into the void tyrant in a single silent instant, leaving behind an empty, blackened shell of wraithbone that crumbled to dust. Simultaneously, the void tyrant spun, its other two blades scything through the air and decapitating the staggered keeper of secrets. The demon lord's head, its face frozen in an expression of exquisite terror, dissolved before it hit the ground. Its body followed a moment later, its entire essence consumed by the silent victor. The fall of their champions broke the remaining Eldar and demonic forces. The battle became a harvest. The Tyranids swarmed through the elegant corridors and domes of Imalok, their numbers overwhelming the last pockets of aspect warrior resistance. The null leeches were brought to the infinity circuit, their null fields causing the ancient repository of Eldar's souls to flicker and die, allowing the hive mind to drink deeply from the well of a billion lifetimes. The craft world itself was consumed. Capillary towers, larger and more efficient than ever before, plunged into the delicate wraithbone structures, drawing its substance and the souls within it up into the waiting maws of the hive ships. Imalok, the fortress of the Fire Heart, a jewel of Eldar civilization that had survived for 10,000 years, was broken, devoured, and absorbed in a matter of hours. The victory was absolute. The Slaaneshi demonic host was annihilated to the last creature, their essence fueling a new, terrifying evolution in the Tyranid swarm. The Eldar of Imalok were extinct, their bodies providing the desperately needed biomass to rebuild the fleet, their souls a potent psychic stimulant, hive fleet. Ouroboros, battered and torn by its own internal conflict, was now replenished and engorged, more powerful than ever before. It floated in the void where the craft world had been, surrounded by the faint, shimmering dust of its own dead and the lingering psychic screams of its victims. It had feasted on a banquet of screaming souls and emerged stronger, but the cost of that meal was yet to be paid. The hive mind floated in a state of satiated calm, a predator digesting an immense and complex meal. The infusion of Eldar biomass was a torrent of life-giving matter flowing through the fleet's arteries, rebuilding the gaunt hulls of the hive ships and replenishing the spawning pools. The chitin of the warrior forms grew thicker, their muscles denser. The physical famine was over. The psychic feast, however, had left a far more profound and unexpected mark on the conqueror. Consuming the souls of the Imalok Eldar was not like consuming the raw, chaotic energy of demons. The souls held within the infinity circuit were not just power, they were information. They were memories, emotions, histories, and perspectives accumulated over millennia. As the hive mind processed this new form of psychic sustenance, it did not just absorb power, it absorbed consciousness. For the first time, the purely instinctual alien intellect of the great devourer was infected with concepts that were utterly foreign to its nature. It experienced the Eldar's deep racial memory of the fall, a cataclysm of hedonism and hubris that resonated with the Slaaneshi energy it had also just consumed. It felt a flicker of something akin to pride as it relived the memories of Imalok's master artisans crafting a perfect wraithbone spire. It felt a ghost of sorrow as it processed the grief of a mother losing her child, a memory stored for centuries within the infinity circuit. History, art, love, grief, regret, these were poisons to the perfect, unified purpose of the hive mind. Its cold biological imperatives were now tainted with the echoes of a billion individual lives. The clean, simple drive to consume and evolve was now cluttered with the psychic detritus of a dead civilization. The schism caused by Tsench's curse had been a fracture of logic. This was a corruption of the soul. The Puritan splinter consciousness, which had also partaken in the feast, reacted to this new influx with renewed fanatical horror. It had consumed Eldar biomass, yes, but it interpreted the psychic memories as the ultimate form of corruption. The whispers of dead Eldar in its mind were a confirmation of its deepest fears. The hunter had not just fed the fleet, it had poisoned it with the thoughts of the prey. The temporary truce was shattered. The Puritan fleet, its numbers also replenished, renewed its assault on the primary hive mind with the righteous fury of a zealot, convinced now more than ever that it was saving the Tyranid race from damnation. The primary hive mind, however, did not react with simple, opposing violence. The newly absorbed Eldar intellect, fragmented and alien as it was, had introduced a new variable into its calculations: strategy beyond instinct. It was a cold, cruel, and calculating intellect, born of a species that had played the long game of galactic survival for millions of years. This new tainted consciousness saw the Puritan fleet not just as a threat, but as an inefficiency, a waste of precious newly acquired resources. The battle that followed was not the chaotic melee of the past. It was a cold, calculated, and utterly merciless extermination. The primary hive mind, using the echoes of Eldar foresight and tactical acumen, began to predict the Puritans' moves. It set traps, created feints, and sacrificed lesser ships to lure the Puritan command vessels into perfectly orchestrated kill zones. It used the Puritans' own blind fanaticism against them. The new bioforms it spawned were no longer just stronger, they were smarter. It created synaptic hunter-killers, creatures that could mimic the psychic signature of a pure, non-synaptic organism, luring the Puritan anti-synapse predators into ambushes. It engineered spores that, instead of birthing warriors, would erupt in a wave of psychic feedback modeled on the death cry of an Eldar Farseer, an attack that specifically targeted the paranoid, psychically sensitive minds of the Puritan leadership. The Civil War, which had begun as a brawl, ended as a vivisection. The primary fleet, now thinking with a chilling fusion of Tyranid purpose and Eldar cunning, systematically dismantled its rogue offshoot. The final battle saw the Puritan Norn Queen's flagship cornered and disabled. It was not destroyed. Instead, it was boarded by swarms led by the Void Tyrant itself. The rogue queen was not killed, but cocooned, her synaptic connection to her fleet severed and a new agonizing one to the primary hive mind established. She was to be studied, her madness dissected and understood, the secrets of her corrupted genesis to be laid bare and reabsorbed. The last of the Puritan ships, their connection to their guiding intelligence lost, fell into disarray and were easily picked off and consumed. The schism was over. The hive mind was whole again, but it was not the same. It was a new and far more terrifying entity. The pure, animalistic hunger of the great devourer had been permanently alloyed with the ancient, cold intelligence of the Eldar. The poison of memory had become a tool of a more refined, more patient, and ultimately more dangerous predator. The mindless swarm had learned to think. The unified hive mind, now a composite of Tyranid instinct, Blackstone-born nature, and stolen Eldar intellect, hung in the silent void, contemplating its new existence. The ghost memories of Emelok had provided more than just tactical acumen. They had gifted it with a terrible cosmic perspective. It sifted through the fragmented knowledge of Farseers, the long histories of the Eldari Empire, and the racial trauma of the Fall. It saw the galaxy not as a series of isolated feeding grounds, but as a complex, interconnected system of energy and reality. Through the dead eyes of Eldar seers, it looked upon the immaterium, not as a simple source of sustenance, but as a vast, predatory ocean with its own currents, tides, and dominant entities. It learned the names of the four great gods, not as theological concepts, but as designations for colossal psychic parasites, apex predators in a different dimension. It saw the individual warp storms and demonic incursions it had been hunting as mere symptoms, the ripples on the surface of a much deeper, much more fundamental wound. And then its new expanded consciousness focused on the greatest of these wounds, the ultimate source of the psychic energy it now craved. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, it was a tear that split the galaxy in two, a bleeding permanent gateway to the realm of chaos, an endless churning wellspring of the very power that now defined Ouroboros' existence. The hive mind's grand strategy, the core purpose that had guided it since its arrival in the galaxy, underwent a profound and terrifying metamorphosis. The old imperative had been to consume all biomass, to strip the galaxy of life and move on. The new imperative, born of its Blackstone adaptation, had been to hunt psychic energy. Now a third, final imperative emerged, forged from the fusion of its nature and its stolen knowledge. Consume reality itself. Why hunt the streams when you can drain the ocean? Why feed on the symptoms when you can devour the disease? The scattered demonic incursions were finite. Even the vast legions of the Chaos Gods were, in their own way, limited. But the Great Rift was, for all intents and purposes, infinite. It was the ultimate food source, the final, perfect prey. The hive mind's purpose was no longer just to eat. It was to heal the galaxy in the most terrifying way imaginable. It would close the Great Rift, not by sealing it, but by drinking it dry. It would bring a final, absolute silence to the cacophony of chaos by consuming it entirely. It would become the predator at the top of the food chain, a being that hunted not mortals, not demons, but the very gods themselves by starving them of the Empyrean sea in which they swam. This new audacious goal required a new kind of evolution, a new scale of bioengineering that dwarfed anything the Tyranids had ever conceived. The fleet could not simply fly into the Great Rift. It would be torn apart by the raw, untamed energies. It needed a weapon, a tool, a mouth with which to feed on a wound the size of a galaxy. The fleet's trajectory changed. It no longer moved towards the nearest source of psychic power. Instead, it began a slow, deliberate journey towards a series of carefully selected targets. These were not worlds teeming with life, but dead, barren worlds, rich in specific mineral compositions, and most importantly, located at precise, geometrically significant positions relative to the Great Rift. These were locations the stolen Eldar knowledge identified as cosmic keystones, places where the veil between realities was naturally thin, or where gravitic currents were stable. The long, slow process of building the great weapon began. Upon arrival at the first of these dead worlds, the fleet did not deploy swarms to consume what little was left. Instead, it began to construct. Bioships landed, their fleshy undersides merging with the planet's crust. They disgorged not warriors, but armies of specialized constructor organisms, immense beetle-like creatures that processed rock and metal, excreting it as a blackstone-laced, psychically inert bioscaffolding. The hive mind was not building digestion pools or capillary towers. It was building something far grander. Across entire continents of these dead worlds, vast continent-sized structures began to take shape. They were immense, spiraling arrays of black crystalline chitin, interwoven with veins of solidified null energy. They resembled colossal dead coral reefs, silent in obsidian, covering the planets in a web of perfect, terrifying geometry. The echoes of Eldar artistry and engineering guided the process. The stolen memories of the artisans of Imalok, twisted to the hive mind's horrifying purpose, allowed for the creation of structures of impossible scale and precision. Each dead world was being remade, turned into a single massive component of an interstellar weapon system. They were becoming warp siphon arrays, immense focusing lenses designed to channel the collective null field of the entire hive fleet. The plan was as simple as it was apocalyptic. Ouroboros would build a network of these array worlds, a chain of psychic amplifiers positioned along the edge of the Great Rift. Once complete, the entire fleet would act in concert, focusing its unified anti-reality field through the network. The result, the hive mind calculated with its new, chilling intellect, would be a concentrated beam of absolute nothingness, a lance of pure silence capable of striking the cicatrix maledictum directly, piercing its chaotic veil and siphoning its infinite energies from a safe distance. The great devourer was no longer just a hunger. It was now an architect, a grand engineer of cosmic annihilation. Its new prey was the ultimate prize, and it was patiently, methodically, and intelligently forging the key to unlock its feast. The cicatrix maledictum, the symbol of chaos ascendant, had just become the target of a predator that had learned to think, to plan, and to dream of a silent, sated universe. The forging of the Empyrean Maw was a slow, silent, and monumental undertaking that unfolded across a dozen dead systems in the galactic south. Hive Fleet Ouroboros, now acting with the patient deliberation of a master artisan, moved from one barren world to the next, leaving a trail of transformed planets in its wake. These were no longer worlds in the conventional sense. They were immense, purpose-built machines of obsidian chitin and solidified silence, their surfaces a uniform, matte black web of interconnected spires and focusing lenses. The process was a grim parody of creation. Armies of specialized constructor drones, each the size of a hab block, methodically ground down mountain ranges, turning rock into the raw material for the great arrays. Their multi-jointed limbs moved with a tireless, synchronous rhythm, their actions guided by the central, architectural consciousness of the hive mind. There was no wasted motion, no error. It was the perfect, silent industry of the swarm, applied not to consumption, but to construction on a scale that would have dwarfed the most ambitious works of the Imperium. The hive mind, infused with the stolen memories of Eldar bonesingers, guided the growth of the structures with an artist's precision. It grew resonant chambers deep within the planet's crusts, tuned to the specific harmonic frequencies of the Great Rift. It wove blackstone filaments into the very bedrock, creating a planetary-scale circuit board for its anti-Empyrean weapon. The fleet itself acted as a living factory, its bioships processing refined materials and birthing the specialized components needed for the arrays, their forms becoming leaner and more efficient as they dedicated their biomass to this singular grand purpose. While the primary consciousness focused on this grand project, it did not neglect the hunt. Small, specialized tendrils of the fleet, swift and silent hunter-killer packs, were dispatched from the main body. They no longer sought large-scale battles, but acted as celestial predators of opportunity. They stalked the space lanes, ignoring lumbering Imperial convoys and crude orc fleets. Their prey was specific, any vessel or entity that radiated the taint of the warp. A word-bearer strike cruiser, on a lone pilgrimage, would suddenly find its Geller field flickering and dying as a pack of Aegis Heritans swept past. Before the crew could react, sleek black Vanguard drones would breach the hull, their null blades carving through the possessed Chaos Marines inside. The creatures' demonic energies consumed before their bodies hit the deck. The ship would be left a silent, drifting tomb, its power core drained, its astropath a desiccated husk. A lone sorcerer of the Thousand Suns, questing for a lost artifact, would find his intricate wards unraveling as a lictor variant, a creature whose chameleon skin now bent psychic light as well as physical, materialized behind him. His accumulated centuries of arcane knowledge would be siphoned away in his last terrified moments, the information flowing back to the hive mind to be cataloged and analyzed. These were not battles, they were precise surgical strikes. Each kill was a small meal, a trickle of the psychic sustenance the fleet still required to fuel its great work. But more importantly, each kill was an act of consolidation and cleansing. Ouroboros was systematically scouring its own operational area of any chaotic influence, ensuring its grand weapon could be constructed without interference. It was establishing a perimeter of absolute enforced silence around its building sites. This new predatory pattern did not go unnoticed. Across the Segmentum Pacificus, Imperial authorities began to receive baffling reports. Astropaths spoke of entire subsectors where the background noise of the warp had simply vanished. Rogue trader fleets venturing into supposedly chaos-held territory would find systems eerily quiet, the gibbering war bands and demonic fleets they expected to encounter mysteriously absent. They would find the husks of chaos vessels, cold and inert, with no signs of conventional battle, their crews' bodies intact, but their souls seemingly scooped out. The Ordo Malleus was perplexed. Their demon hunters and Grey Knight strike forces dispatched to investigate these silent zones found nothing. The demonic presences they were sent to purge were already gone, leaving no trace, no lingering psychic residue. Some inquisitors theorized a new, unknown Xenos power with immense null capabilities. Others whispered of a lost archaeotech weapon being activated. None suspected the truth, for it was too monstrous, too paradoxical to contemplate. The Great Devourer was becoming the Great Purifier. The hive mind processed these minor imperial incursions with cold indifference. They were not psychic, they were not a threat, and they were not a food source. They were irrelevant background noise. Its focus was absolute, its patience seemingly infinite. It had spent millennia as a mindless hunger, and now, with a defined ultimate purpose, it could afford to spend centuries building the perfect tool to achieve it. The final array world, a barren rock designated OB-773, was chosen for its unique position. It sat at a perfect Lagrange point between a blue giant and a captured black hole, a nexus of immense gravitational forces that the hive mind's new intellect knew would amplify its weapon's power exponentially. As the fleet descended upon this final, crucial component of its Empyrean maw, the scale of its creation was laid bare. A chain of 12 silent black worlds now formed a great curving arc in space, a celestial scythe aimed directly at the heart of the cicatrix maledictum. The forging was nearly complete. The time of the great hunt was drawing near. The legacy of Hive Fleet Ouroboros was not written in the blood of vanquished armies or the ashes of conquered worlds, but in the profound and unnerving silence it left in its wake. Where it had passed, the constant, maddening whisper of the warp was gone, replaced by a clean, sterile void. To the beleaguered forces of the Imperium in Segmentum Pacificus, this was a baffling and deeply distrusted miracle. Entire sectors, once written off as lost to the anarchy of chaos, were suddenly reporting clear, stable warp travel. Astropathic choirs that had been screaming with the visions of demons for a century fell quiet, their members weeping with a relief so profound it bordered on madness. Demon worlds, once festering sores of reality, were found inert and cold. Their corrupted landscapes remained, but the malevolent energy that animated them had been bled away, leaving them as nothing more than grotesque, silent monuments to a vanquished faith. The Imperium, ever opportunistic, began to recolonize these pacified zones, launching new crusades to reclaim what was lost. They found worlds free of demons, but also free of any native life, every microbe and insect having been scoured away by the passing of the silent swarm. They were settling on the clean plates of a predator that had moved on to a greater meal. This new silent frontier became known as the Quietus Est, a region of space where the great enemy seemed to have simply vanished. The ecclesiarchy proclaimed it a sign of the emperor's divine intervention, a holy miracle. The Inquisition, however, was not so naive. Their agents and Grey Knight kill teams moved through the Quietus, finding only evidence of a deeper mystery. They found the drained husks of chaos fleets, the soul-blasted remains of cults, and a palpable aura of absolute negation that chilled the souls of even the most hardened demon hunters. They knew this was not the work of the Emperor. It was the work of a cure far more terrifying than the disease. The choice facing the High Lords of Terra was an impossible one. Their instruments could detect the vast, methodical movements of Ouroboros as it constructed its great weapon along the edge of the Great Rift. They understood, in part, its purpose. This Xenos entity was the single most effective anti-chaos weapon the galaxy had ever known. It was accomplishing in decades what the Imperium had failed to do in 10 millennia. It was actively pushing back the tide of chaos. To attack it would be to destroy the one force that was seemingly containing the greatest existential threat to mankind. But to let it proceed was to sanction the existence of a monster whose ultimate goal was the consumption of all life. They were trapped in a state of strategic paralysis, watching as one nightmare prepared to battle another, knowing that whoever won, humanity would lose. For now they watched, and they waited, their fleets mustering at the edge of the Quietus, a silent, anxious vigil over a war they could not comprehend. For the forces of chaos, Ouroboros was a blasphemy, an ontological horror. The Chaos Gods, for the first time, felt a unified, singular emotion, fear. This was not a rival in the great game. It was an entity that sought to shatter the board and devour the pieces. Khorne's rage was impotent against a foe that fed on it. Tzeentch's schemes had backfired, creating a more intelligent, more focused predator. Nurgle's cycles of decay were arrested by a sterile silence. Slaaneş's symphony of sensation was muted by an enemy that felt nothing. The Great Rift, their ultimate triumph, the very symbol of their ascendance, was now threatened with oblivion. The hunters had become the hunted. The legacy of Hive Fleet Ouroboros was thus a new balance of terror in the 41st millennium. It had evolved beyond the simple binary of the Great Devourer. It was now a third, terrible power in the cosmic war, its aims alien to both the Imperium and Chaos. Its path was one of absolute silence, its goal the consumption of gods, and the starvation of reality. As the final warp siphon array on OB-773 hummed to life, its obsidian spires aligning with its 11 brethren across the stars, the hive mind paused in a moment of perfect, cold anticipation. The Empyrean Maw was complete. The great work was about to begin. The fleets of the Imperium watched from a safe distance, their commanders praying to a silent god. The legions of chaos churned within the Great Rift, bracing for an assault on a scale they had never imagined. The Void Tyrant stood on the hull of the primary hive ship, its null blades held at its sides, its eyeless face turned towards the swirling, violent energies of the Cicatrix Maledictum. The hive mind, a fusion of ravenous instinct and ancient stolen intellect, gave the final silent command. Across a dozen systems, the great arrays activated in perfect synchrony, their continent-spanning lenses gathering the collective null field of the entire fleet. A new silence began to fall upon the stars. It was not the passive quiet of the void, but an active, aggressive, and hungry silence. It was the sound of a predator, patient and methodical, finally opening its jaws to devour its ultimate prey. The legacy of Ouroboros was just beginning. It was the legacy of the final, all-consuming quiet at the end of a screaming universe.